I still remember the smell of that warehouse. Dust, old wood, motor oil, and something else. Something I couldn't name at the time. Maybe it was loneliness. Maybe it was failure. Or maybe it was just the smell of a life that hadn't turned out the way anyone expected. I was 50, 3 years old, lying on a folded moving blanket on a cold concrete floor, staring up at a ceiling I couldn't even see in the dark. My phone had 17 missed calls, none of them from my wife. Outside, the wind was pushing against the metal walls, and the whole building groaned like it was in pain. And I thought to myself, how did I end up here, not in the warehouse? I knew how I ended up in the warehouse. I mean, how did I end up here, in this life, with these people, in this silence? And then I thought about my father, about the last thing he ever said to me. And I finally understood what he meant. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning, because this story, my story, it didn't start with the warehouse. It started 40 years ago, with 2 brothers and a father who loved them both too much to let them see what he was really doing for them. Part 2, My Father's World. My father's name was Raymond Earl Hollies, and if you'd met him on the street, you would have thought he was nobody special. He wore the same 3 shirts on rotation. He drove a 20-year-old pickup truck with a cracked side mirror he fixed with electrical tape. He ate his lunch out of a metal tin every day, packed by himself every morning since my mother passed when I was 12. He didn't talk much. He didn't brag. He didn't complain. He just worked. My father worked as a maintenance supervisor for a property management company for 31 years. He fixed things, boilers, pipes, electrical panels, broken locks. He was the kind of man who could look at something broken and immediately understand why it broke and exactly how to fix it. People underestimated him his whole life, his bosses, his neighbors, his own family, sometimes including me, including my brother, Derek. Derek is 2 years older than me. He's always been the charming one, the one who knew how to walk into a room and make people like him before he even opened his mouth. He became a sales manager for a medical equipment company. He married a woman named Pamela who came from money. They drove nice cars. They took vacations to places I'd only seen in magazines, and they made sure you knew it. I chose a different path. I became a contractor, small renovation work, home repairs, the kind of jobs that kept food on the table but never made anyone rich. I married Sandra when I was 28. We had a son, Marcus, who was 22 at the time this story takes place. Sandra was not an unkind woman when we married. At least, I don't think she was. But somewhere along the years, I'm still not sure exactly when she began to see me differently. Not as a partner, not as a provider, but as a disappointment. She never said it directly, not for a long time. But you can feel it when someone looks at you and sees something less than what they hoped for. My father passed away on a Thursday morning in late October. He went peacefully, they said, in his sleep. The hospice nurse called me at 6 in the morning, and I drove to his house alone because Sandra said she had an important work call. She couldn't move. I sat with him for a while even after he was gone. I don't know why. It just felt wrong to leave right away. He looked smaller somehow, quieter, like the whole room had exhaled. The funeral was small. My father had outlived most of his friends, and the ones who were left were too old or too sick to travel. Derek came with Pamela, dressed like they were attending a charity gala. Sandra came too, standing slightly apart from me the whole time, checking her phone twice when she thought I wasn't looking. 2 weeks after the funeral, we gathered at my father's attorney's office for the reading of the will. There were only a few of us in that conference room, me, Derek, Pamela, Sandra, and my father's younger sister, Aunt Carol, who'd driven 4 hours and looked like she'd been crying since the day he died. The attorney, a quiet man named Mr. Ferris, opened the folder and read in a flat, professional voice. Derek received the beach house. It was the crown jewel of my father's small estate. A 3-bedroom house on the coast, 2 hours from the city. My father had bought it decades ago for almost nothing and held on to it, while the land around it turned into vacation gold. By current estimates, it was worth somewhere between $800,000 and $1 million. Derek smiled when he heard it. Not a big smile, just a small one at the corner of his mouth. Pamela squeezed his arm. Then Mr. Ferris continued. I received the warehouse. It was an old commercial building on the edge of the industrial district, about 6,000 square feet on a half-acre lot. My father had purchased it 15 years ago for reasons that, at the time, none of us understood. It had been used for storage, briefly, and then sat mostly empty. The roof had been repaired once. The plumbing worked. The electrical was old but functional. That was it. No cash, no investments, no other properties. The rest of the estate, a modest savings account, was split evenly between us to cover any estate taxes or outstanding debts. I remember looking at the paper in front of me and feeling something I wasn't expecting. Not anger, not even disappointment, exactly, just confusion. Why, my father was not a careless man. He was not a man who did things without a reason. Everything he did had a reason, even when you couldn't see it. So why had he given Derek the beautiful house on the ocean, the thing worth nearly $1 million, and given me a dusty, empty warehouse in the industrial part of town? I didn't ask out loud. I just sat there, quiet, folding the paper in my hands while Derek shook Mr. Ferris's hand, and Pamela started talking about how they'd probably rent the beach house out in the summers. Aunt Carol caught my eye from across the table. She gave me a look I didn't understand then, a look I would understand much, much later. The dinner, 3 days after the will reading, Sandra called a family dinner. Her sister, Brenda, came. Her brother-in-law, Craig, our son Marcus, and Sandra's mother, Elaine, who had never particularly liked me but had been politely distant about it for 25 years. We sat around the dining room table that Sandra had chosen, and I had assembled on a Saturday afternoon 8 years ago. I remember it because I'd scraped my knuckles on the metal frame and bled on the instruction sheet. The food was good. Sandra was a good cook when she wanted to be. For the first 20 minutes, things were fine. Normal conversation. Marcus talked about a job interview he'd had. Brenda complained about her neighbor's dog. Craig made a joke nobody laughed at. And then Brenda asked the question. So, she said, cutting her chicken, how did the will reading go? Did Raymond leave you both something good? Sandra answered before I could. Derek got the beach house, she said. Her voice was perfectly controlled. Which is worth about $1 million. A pause around the table. And us? Brenda asked. Sandra set down her fork. We got the warehouse. The way she said it. Those 3 words. We got the warehouse. The way her lips pressed together after. The look she exchanged with Brenda that she thought was invisible. Well, Craig said, trying to lighten the air, a warehouse is something, isn't it? You could store. It's nothing, Sandra said. Quietly, plainly, like she was reading a weather report. An old, broken-down warehouse in the worst part of the city, worth maybe $150,000 on a good day, while Derek gets a beach house. Sandra, I started. Don't, she looked at me then, and there was something in her eyes that had clearly been building for a long time. Don't explain it to me, James. Don't tell me there must be a reason. Don't tell me your father was a wise man, because a wise man does not look at his 2 sons and decide that one of them is worth $800,000 more than the other. The table was very quiet. I looked at Marcus. He was staring at his plate. It's not about the money, I said. I kept my voice low. Dad had his reasons. His reasons. Sandra laughed. It was not a warm sound. James, do you know what I've lived with for 25 years? Do you know what I've told myself? Every time the refrigerator broke and we had to wait 3 weeks to fix it. Every time I watched Pamela show up in a new car. Every time we didn't go on a vacation because we couldn't afford it. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself you were building towards something. I told myself you were a good man, and good men are rewarded. She picked up her fork again. And now your father is gone, and the one chance for something to change, and he gives it to Derek. He gives the real thing to Derek and gives you a warehouse. I didn't say anything. I had learned over many years that silence was the safest response to this kind of fire. Not because I was weak, but because when words come out of a place that painful, responding with more words doesn't help. You just wait for it to pass, but it didn't pass. You know what your problem is, Sandra said. And now the table was so quiet, I could hear the heating system in the walls. You have always been content with less. Always. Your whole life, James, you have accepted less. Less money, less ambition, less standing, and I am so tired of it. Elaine, Sandra's mother, made a small sound of sympathy, and it was not directed at me. You're being a little hard on him, maybe, Marcus said quietly. Sandra turned to him. Am I? Marcus, do you want to end up like this? Working small jobs your whole life, patching other people's walls, and then dying and leaving behind a warehouse? Mom, I'm asking you a question. The silence stretched. I put my napkin on the table. I pushed back my chair. I stood up, Sandra. I said, very quietly, I'm going to go. Go where? She looked genuinely puzzled for just a moment. For some air. She studied me for a second, and then she said the thing I will never fully forget. No matter how much time passes, no matter how much happens after. Maybe don't come back tonight, she said. Maybe stay in your warehouse, since it's all you've got. I looked at her, at Brenda, who was looking at the tablecloth, at Craig, who was suddenly very interested in his water glass, at Elaine, who met my eyes for exactly 1 second before looking away, and at Marcus, my son, who looked like he wanted to disappear. I said nothing. I picked up my jacket from the hook by the door. I picked up my keys, and I walked out into the cold October night. The first night, I sat in my truck in the driveway for a few minutes. I'm not going to pretend I wasn't hurt. I was. There's a particular kind of pain that comes not from being struck, but from being named, from having someone look at you and say out loud the thing you were afraid might be true about yourself. Useless. She hadn't used that exact word at the table, but it was in every sentence, every pause, every look exchanged with her sister. I started the truck. I drove for about 20 minutes, not entirely sure where I was going, and then I found myself turning onto Meridian Street into the industrial district, past the auto body shop, past the sheet metal company, past the empty lot where a tire warehouse used to be. And then I pulled up in front of my warehouse, our warehouse, my warehouse. I still had the key from when I'd visited it briefly after the will reading, just to see what we were dealing with. I got out of the truck. The street was quiet. One streetlight flickered about 50 feet away. The air smelled like cold metal and exhaust. I unlocked the side door and stepped inside. It was dark and large and very still. I found the breaker panel near the door and flipped it. About a third of the overhead fluorescent lights came on, a few flickered, a few didn't work at all, but it was enough to see by. The space was massive. The ceiling was about 20 feet high. Old wooden shelving units lined 2 of the walls. There was a small office area partitioned off in the back corner, a plywood, and drywall box with a window looking out into the main floor, a desk, a filing cabinet, a space heater that I hope still worked. I walked slowly through the space. My footsteps echoed, and then I stopped, because I noticed something I hadn't noticed during my first quick visit. Along the far wall, behind one of the large shelving units, there was a door. Not a large door, just a regular interior door, painted the same gray as the wall. Easy to miss if you weren't looking. I pulled the shelving unit aside and opened the door. Behind it was a staircase. Leading down, I found the light switch, clicked it. The stairs were clean, newer than the rest of the building. And at the bottom, I stopped breathing for a moment. At the bottom of those stairs was another space. Maybe 2,000 square feet, but this space was different. It had been renovated. Insulated walls, proper lighting, a polished concrete floor, a small bathroom with modern plumbing, a kitchenette along one wall, a utility sink, and along the far wall, shelves, but not old wooden ones, metal shelves, clean and organized. On those shelves were boxes and filing cabinets, and stacked beside those cabinets, leaning in a neat row, blueprints. I picked one up. It was a development plan for this property, dated 3 years ago. I started opening boxes. And that is when everything began to change. The twist, I sat on the floor of that underground room for almost 4 hours. I read every document, every folder, every paper in every box, and by the time I was done, my hands were shaking. My father had not given me a broken-down warehouse. My father had given me a future. Here is what I found. 3 years before he died, my father had quietly hired a development consultant and a property attorney. He had spent over a year researching the industrial district, specifically this block, this address. And what he had discovered was this. The city had approved, in private planning sessions, a major urban renewal project. The industrial district was being rezoned for mixed-use development, new apartments, retail spaces, restaurants. The plan was to be announced publicly within the next 18 months. The warehouse sat on a corner lot, a prime corner lot, in the exact center of the planned development zone. The consultant's report, dated 2 years ago, estimated the Postries' owning value of the property at between $4 and $6 million, possibly more, depending on how the development unfolded. There was more. My father had already made contact, through his attorney, with 2 separate real estate development companies who had expressed interest in purchasing or partnering on the lot. There were letters of intent, preliminary numbers. One of the developers had offered, in writing, $3.8 million as a starting point for negotiation, and the letter noted that this number was flexible upward. And tucked inside the last folder, a sealed envelope with my name on it, in my father's handwriting. I opened it. The letter inside was handwritten on 2 pages of notebook paper, in the careful, slightly uneven letters of a man whose hands had worked hard his whole life. James, I know you're confused. I know you're probably sitting somewhere right now feeling like I chose Derek over you, and I need you to know that's not what happened. I've watched both of you your whole lives. I know who you both are. Derek is a good man, but he needs what's in front of him. He needs to see it to believe it. The beach house will give him security, and he'll be happy with that, and that's okay. But you, James, you have always been able to sit with something broken and not give up on it. You have always been able to wait. You have always been able to work without needing anyone to applaud you. That's not weakness, son. I know some people have made you feel like it is, but it is the rarest thing in the world. The warehouse is not what it looks like. Look behind the shelf on the north wall. Go downstairs, read everything, understand what I've set up for you. I spent my last 3 years building this for you. Every hour I wasn't sleeping or eating or in the hospital, I was working on this, because I wanted you to have the thing I never had, not just security, but the moment when everything turns around. The moment when the people who underestimated you have to see who you really are. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you while I was alive. I was afraid the word would get out before the city made the announcement. I was afraid Derek or Pamela would find a way to make it complicated. I needed you to find it yourself when it was just you and the building and the truth. I love you, son. I am so proud of the man you are. Don't be angry at the people who hurt you. Just let them see. Dad, I read that letter 3 times. And then I sat in the silence of that underground room that my father had built for me, in the building he had chosen for me, surrounded by the future he had quietly, patiently constructed, and I wept, not from sadness, from something much harder to name. I slept in the warehouse that night. I dragged a moving blanket from one of the shelving units in the upper space, carried it downstairs, and slept on the floor of the renovated room. The space heater worked. It wasn't comfortable, but I was warmer than I expected, and quieter than I'd been in years. I woke up at 6 in the morning. My phone had 22 missed calls, 13 from Sandra, 4 from Marcus, 3 from Brenda, 1 from an unknown number, 1 from Derek. I didn't call any of them back yet. Instead, I made a cup of coffee using a small coffee maker I found plugged in on the kitchenette counter. My father had thought of everything, and I sat at the small table and I read the documents again, and then I called Mr. Ferris, the attorney. He picked up on the 3rd ring. Mr. Hollies, he said, and there was something in his voice, a kind of warm, knowing quality, that told me he had been waiting for this call. I take it you found everything. Yes, I said. Your father was very specific about how he wanted this handled. He didn't want you to know before the reading, and he didn't want the family to know after the reading, not until you were ready to move forward. How much do you know? I asked. Everything. Mr. Ferris said, I've been working with your father on this for 3 years. The development announcement from the city is expected in the next 4 to 6 months. We have 3 interested buyers. The strongest offer, as you've seen, is already at 3.8 million, and that was before the formal rezoning announcement. Once it goes public, the number will go up. I set down my coffee cup. He really did this, I said, more to myself than to him. He did, Mr. Ferris said. He was a very determined man, your father. He called me every 2 weeks for 3 years. He never missed an update. He told me once. The attorney paused, and I could hear the smile in his voice. He told me, my son James is like a good foundation. You build on it, and it holds. You just have to give him something worth building. I didn't trust my voice to respond to that. What do I do now? I asked. Now, said Mr. Ferris, we move forward, at your pace, on your terms. I can have a meeting set up with the lead developer by the end of the week, if you want. Yes, I said. Let's do that. I went home that afternoon. Sandra was in the kitchen when I came in. She was on the phone, and she looked up when she heard the door. A quick, uncertain look, like she wasn't sure whether to be relieved or defiant. She ended her call. We stood in the kitchen for a moment. You slept there, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes, I didn't mean for you to actually. She stopped, started again. Brenda thought maybe I'd gone too far. Brenda was right, I said. Not unkindly, just plainly. Sandra looked at the counter. I've been under a lot of stress, James. The money situation, and then the will, and seeing Pamela and Derek get. I know. I said. I shouldn't have said what I said. No, you shouldn't have. She looked up. She was expecting me to say more, to accept the partial apology and move on, the way I usually did. To smooth it over, to be the person who made things comfortable again. But I didn't do that. I'm going to need a few days to think, I said. About the house, about us, about a lot of things, she blinked. What does that mean? It means I have some business to take care of, and while I'm taking care of it, I'd like some space. Business? She said it like the word confused her. What business? The warehouse? Yes, I said, the warehouse. I watched her face try to decide what to make of that. She opened her mouth once, closed it. Okay, she said finally. I packed a bag. I went back to the warehouse. Over the next 6 weeks, I worked with Mr. Ferris and the development team. I learned things I didn't know I could learn. About zoning, about development rights, about negotiation, about what it means to own something that the right people want badly enough to compete for. 2 more developers entered discussions once word began to spread, quietly, professionally, that the corner property on Meridian Street was entering negotiation. By the time the city made its formal rezoning announcement, which happened on a bright Tuesday morning in late November, I had 3 offers on the table. The highest was $4.6 million. I also had a 4th option, a development partnership, where I retained partial ownership of whatever was built on the site. The projected return on that option, over 10 years, was higher than any of the sale prices. I chose the partnership. It was Marcus who told Derek first. I hadn't planned it that way. But Marcus had come to visit me at the warehouse, showing up one evening with food from a diner down the street, and an expression on his face that was equal parts guilt and love. We sat downstairs and we talked for 3 hours. I showed him the documents. I showed him the letter from his grandfather. I watched his face as he read. When he finished, he set everything down carefully on the table and looked at me for a long moment. "Dad," he said, "I'm sorry. You don't have, no," he said. I sat at that table and I didn't say enough. I said one thing and then I just let it go, and that wasn't right. His jaw was tight. He was 22 years old, and he looked, in that moment, so much like my father that it almost knocked the air out of me. "Grandpa knew," Marcus said softly. "He knew exactly who you were." "He did," I said. Marcus called Derek that night. I don't know exactly what was said, but the next morning Derek called me. There was a long pause on the phone before he spoke. "James," he said. His voice was different, quieter than I'd ever heard it. "I need to talk to you." "Okay." Another pause. "I didn't know," Derek said, "about any of it. I assumed, we all assumed. I know." I went back and read Dad's letter again, Derek said. The one he left for me with the beach house documents. I didn't pay much attention to it at first. I was too excited about the property. He stopped. "But I read it again last night." He wrote, he said the beach house was for rest and peace, for slowing down, and he wrote, Derek's voice was unsteady now, "The real inheritance I left James is not about money. It is about finally letting the world see the man I always knew he was. Don't be jealous, Derek. Be proud of your brother. He earned this in ways neither of you know yet." The line was very quiet. I didn't know what he meant. Derek said, "Until Marcus called me." I didn't say anything for a moment. "It's okay," I said finally. "It's not, though." I'd never heard Derek sound like that. "You slept in the warehouse, James, because of us, because of Sandra, and because I didn't say a word, and because we all sat there and made you feel like, Derek." He stopped. "It's okay," I said again. Dad knew what he was doing. He knew all of us well enough to know that I needed to find this alone, in the quiet, without anyone trying to fix it or explain it or take credit for it. He knew I needed to sit in that building by myself and find it. I paused. He knew because that's how I've always worked, quietly, alone without applause, a long silence. "I'm proud of you," Derek said. His voice cracked slightly on the last word. It was the first time in my life my brother had ever said those words to me. Sandra found out on a Friday evening, not from me, from Pamela, who had heard from Derek, who had been calling around in that way that emotional people do when they're trying to process something too large to hold alone. I was at the warehouse. The downstairs room had become something like a home base by then, a place I was spending more time than our house, when my phone rang. It was Sandra. She didn't speak for the first several seconds after I picked up. I could hear her breathing. "Pamela told me," she finally said. "Okay, $4.6 million. That's one of the offers, yes. I'm going with a development partnership instead. James," her voice broke. "Just slightly. James, you don't have to. I called you useless." The words came out in a rush, raw, like she'd been holding them too long. I sat at that table with my family, with our son, and I looked at you, and I called you useless, and told you to go sleep in the warehouse. You didn't use the word useless, I said. You know what I meant. You've always known exactly what I meant, James. That's the worst part. She was crying now. I could hear it clearly. You just sat there. You picked up your jacket, and you walked out with your dignity completely intact. And I sat there, and I waited. I don't know who I became, she said. I don't know when I stopped seeing you. I just know that I did. And your father saw you the whole time. He saw you better than I did. Better than any of us. I sat with that for a long moment. I know you're angry, she said. I'm not angry, I said, and the strange thing was it was true. I had moved through the anger somewhere in the third or fourth day in the warehouse, lying on that moving blanket. I'd felt it and I'd let it go. What was left was something quieter, something tired and clear. What are you then? She asked. Sad, I said, and hopeful, in equal parts. Hopeful that people can change, that things can be different, that we don't have to be who we were at our worst moment. She cried for a while longer. I let her. I won't pretend the story ended with a perfect bow tied around it. Life doesn't work that way. Sandra and I went to counseling. We spent many uncomfortable hours in an office talking about things we'd spent years not saying. Some of it was painful in ways I wasn't prepared for. Some of it was strangely freeing. We are still together, but we are different together than we were. Less convenient, more honest, harder and also better. Marcus used part of the initial development, advanced to start a small business he'd been dreaming about for 2 years. I didn't tell him to. He came to me and asked if I thought it was a good idea, and I said yes, and that was enough. Derek and Pamela come down to the beach house most summers now. They invited us the first summer after everything came out. We went. It was awkward at first, the way things are when people are trying to rebuild something that wasn't quite as solid as they thought. But it got easier. Derek and I talk on the phone every couple of weeks now, sometimes about nothing important, sometimes about our father. The development partnership, I won't give you all the numbers, because this isn't really a story about money. But I will say this. The morning I signed the final papers, I drove to the cemetery first. I sat by my father's grave for about 20 minutes. I didn't say much. I just said, I found it, Dad. I found everything you left, and I understand now. And thank you. Here is what I have come to understand in the time since all of this happened. My father was not a wealthy man by the world's standards. He wore the same 3 shirts. He drove a truck with a taped mirror. He ate his lunch out of a metal tin every single day. But my father was the richest man I have ever known in the ways that actually matter. He was rich in patience. He spent 3 years building something for me without telling anyone, without getting any credit, without any applause, without anyone saying what a good father he is. He just did the work, quietly, because it needed to be done. He was rich in perception. He looked at his 2 sons, and he did not see what the world saw. He did not see the charming one and the ordinary one. He saw Derek, who needed beauty and rest and a view of the ocean to feel secure. And he saw James, who needed something to build, who would only truly live when he had the chance to show the world what he could do with something that looked like nothing. He was rich in love, not the loud kind, not the kind that announces itself at every dinner table and expects gratitude in return. The quiet kind, the kind that works in the dark without any witnesses, the kind that waits years to be understood. And here is what I want to say to you, to anyone watching this who has ever felt underestimated, who has ever sat at a table where someone you love looked at you and saw something smaller than what you are. Who has ever walked out into the cold night feeling like you had nothing, You don't always know what you're holding. Sometimes what looks like nothing, an old warehouse, an empty lot, a broken thing that no one else wants, is exactly the thing that was meant for you. Specifically, deliberately, by someone who understood you better than you knew. And sometimes the people who dismiss you, the people who say you are less, the people who tell you to go sleep in your warehouse, sometimes they are doing you a favor. Because they push you out of the comfortable places. They push you into the quiet. And in the quiet, you find the stairs. And at the bottom of the stairs, you find the truth. My father always said, the loudest rooms hold the least of worth. Quiet places hold everything. I didn't understand what he meant when he was alive. I do now. If you're watching this and you feel like you've been underestimated by your family, by your spouse, by people who should have seen you better, I want you to hear this. Keep going. Not for them, not to prove anything, not for the day they finally see you. Keep going because somewhere, maybe right now, there is a door behind a shelf on a wall, and behind that door is a staircase. And at the bottom of that staircase is the life your father, or the universe, or God, or whatever you believe in, has been quietly building for you. You just have to stay in the room long enough to find it. Thank you for watching. And if this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone you love, or of yourself, or of the quiet, patient people in your life who never got enough credit, please subscribe. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And leave a comment below telling me about someone in your life who loved you quietly, without applause. I read every single one. God bless you, and go find your staircase.